Welcome to the deep dive. You've been exploring some really compelling material on revolutions, and for this deep dive, our goal is to, well, cut through the complexity and understand the core of what a revolution is.
Hmm.
We're going to look at the different forms they take, what sparks them, and, the lasting impact they can have. You've given us a fantastic range of sources, from broad definitions to specific historical events and some really thought-provoking philosophical takes.
Yeah, absolutely.
Our aim is to pull out the most insightful bits without getting totally bogged down.
Exactly. You've provided a rich collection of ideas here, and I think the first thing we really need to nail down is a clear working definition of revolution itself. Drawing from your sources, the common thread seems to be a major and often sudden shift in government and its related structures.
Right.
And crucially, it frequently involves challenging the established order for something fundamentally different.
Okay, let's unpack that a bit. Major and often sudden shift. That immediately makes me think of, dramatic upheaval, big changes fast.
Right.
But it sounds like the concept goes beyond just who's in charge politically, doesn't it? The sources also talk about social, economic, even cultural transformation.
That's a really critical point.
Yeah.
While our sort of first mental picture of a revolution might be that political overthrow, many revolutions, particularly what the sources call social revolutions, lead to much broader changes.
Yeah.
Changes in how a society is actually organized. This covers everything, really the economy, social classes,
Yeah.
even everyday customs and beliefs. Your sources also touch on the difference between these rapid, often violent changes and maybe slower, more gradual, transformative processes that unfold over a longer time.
Right. And, while we sometimes throw the term revolution around for big tech shifts or like the Industrial Revolution for this deep dive, we're really honing in on those political and social earthquakes. Those seem to be the ones that fundamentally reshape, well, the whole fabric of a society.
Precisely, yeah. So with that kind of understanding of what we mean by revolution, it becomes pretty essential to look at the different categories your sources highlight. It helps us grasp the varying aims and scopes of these events.
Absolutely. So let's start with political revolutions. Here, the focus seems mainly on changing who holds political power. The American Revolution, the Mexican Revolution, those are the key examples given.
Right. And what's interesting about political revolutions specifically is that their central goal really is that change in ruling authority or the system of government.
Okay.
The American Revolution, for instance, was fundamentally about, well, independence from Britain, right?
Yeah.
Establishing a new nation, different political framework.
Yeah.
Similarly, the Mexican Revolution complex definitely had social dimensions, but it involved huge shifts in political leadership and the structure of the state itself.
Okay. Then we get to social revolutions. This sounds like it goes much deeper than just swapping out leaders. The French Revolution, the Russian Revolution are the prime examples here.
Exactly. Social revolutions are defined by these much more profound transformations. They aren't just about a change at the top. They involve a fundamental restructuring of society. We're talking the economic system, social hierarchy, cultural norms, the works.
Wow.
The French Revolution, with its whole liberty, equality, fraternity thing, aimed to completely dismantle the old feudal order. The Russian Revolution went even further, trying not just to overthrow the Tsar, but to take down the entire capitalist system.
And that leads into the third category, communist revolutions. These are specifically rooted in Marxist ideas, this vision of a classless society achieved by the working class, the proletariat overthrowing the property owners. The Russian Revolution pops up again here, naturally alongside the Chinese Communist Revolution.
Yeah, and what's core to communist revolutions is this ambition to radically change the economic structure. The whole idea is putting control of production in the hands of the working class. The revolutions in Russia and China, though they happened in really different contexts, both aim to establish that principle. And boy, did they have a massive global impact in the 20th century.
Okay, these distinctions like political, social, communist, that gives us a really helpful framework, understanding their different goals, different scales of change. Now, one detail that really caught my eye in the sources was this idea of failed or abortive revolutions.
Yes, that's a crucial aspect to consider. Yeah. It's easy to just focus on the ones that, the ones that successfully took power and changed things.
Sure.
But your sources remind us that even revolutions that don't achieve their immediate aims can still have a pretty significant historical impact. They can mobilize huge numbers of people, bring critical issues to the forefront, and ultimately shape history, even without that immediate power transfer. It really highlights how dynamic and frankly, unpredictable these revolutionary processes are.
So even if a rebellion gets crushed.
Exactly. Even then, the underlying grievances, the reasons people were rising up, might still resonate and fuel future movements down the line.
That's fascinating. Okay, here's where it gets really interesting for me. Let's shift focus to how thinkers throughout history have actually viewed revolutions. It seems like the understanding has, well, changed quite a bit over time.
Oh, absolutely. The historical and scholarly perspectives have undergone a dramatic evolution. Early views, thinking way back to ancient Greece through the Middle Ages, they generally saw revolutions as fundamentally destructive.
Like a bad thing, full stop.
Pretty much. Thinkers like Plato, Aristotle, they really emphasize societal stability, moral order, religious values as essential safeguards against that kind of upheaval. Revolution was almost seen as a symptom of, like, societal decay.
So avoid at all costs, basically. Maintain order.
Precisely. Preserve the existing structure.
Yeah.
But then with the Renaissance, the rise of secular humanism, we start seeing a shift. Figures like Machiavelli started analyzing power in a more pragmatic, secular way, not necessarily advocating revolution, but looking at how power works.
Right, separating it from morality a bit more.
Exactly. And then you get thinkers like Milton, who actually argued revolution could be a justifiable defense against tyranny. That's a huge shift, revolution potentially being legitimate.
That is a profound turning point, moving from inherently bad to potentially necessary.
It really is. And by the 18th century, with revolutions like the American and French aiming for ideals like freedom, self-governance, we see another evolution. Your sources even mention Kant viewing these as potentially representing, like, epical progress for humanity.
Wow, ethical progress.
Yeah, there was a sense of utopian possibility tied to revolutionary change for some of those Enlightenment thinkers.
And then comes the 19th century, Hegel, Marx. This seems to frame revolution not just as something that might happen, but almost as like an inevitable part of how history unfolds.
Hegel's influence was immense.
So when we talk about Hegel's influence, this idea of historical dialectics, what does that basically mean here?
That's a great question. So Hegel's idea was that history progresses through conflict, sort of a back and forth between opposing ideas or forces, he called it thesis, versus antithesis, leading to a new, higher synthesis.
Okay.
Marx grabbed that framework and adapted it. He argued the main engine of historical change was class conflict, specifically the owners versus the workers.
Ah, okay.
He saw this class struggle as inevitably leading to a proletarian revolution and ultimately a classless society. So for Marx, revolution wasn't just a possibility, it was like a predicted, necessary stage in history.
Right, baked into the system itself. And then jumping ahead to the mid-20th century, we get Crane Brinton's analysis. This sounds more systematic, almost scientific.
Yeah, Brinton's work was really influential. He did a comparative analysis of several big revolutions: English Civil War, American, French, Russian, trying to spot recurring patterns.
What kind of pattern?
Well, he looked at the conditions before a revolution: widespread dissatisfaction, economic problems, people losing faith in the rulers, that kind of thing.
Preconditions.
Exactly. And he also outlined a sort of natural history of revolutions, identifying different phases they tend to go through, from initial optimism and moderate reforms to the rise of more radical factions and eventually maybe a Thermidorian reaction where things kind of settle down, often into a new, sometimes more conservative order.
Fascinating. Seeing these different lenses, feared, maybe hoped for, almost predictable. Which brings us right to the crucial question. What actually causes a revolution? What lights the fuse?
Well, the sources point to a kind of convergence of factors. As Aristotle noted way back when, a decline in shared moral or religious beliefs can make a society more vulnerable.
Okay, a weakening of the social glue.
Right, and Brinton builds on that, highlighting how a gradual erosion of values can weaken political authority, leading to reform movements that might escalate.
And of course, we can't ignore Marx's point about class struggle, that fundamental conflict over economic resources. That seems like a constant undercurrent.
Absolutely. That struggle for economic power, the inequalities, undeniable drivers of unrest, and then you have the more immediate triggers like oppressive rulers, tyrants.
Right.
And just that fundamental human desire for freedom, like Milton talked about. It really seems to be this complex mix: long-term societal shifts, economic pressures, political grievances, all creating fertile ground.
So it's rarely just one thing.
Almost never. It's when these factors align, especially when people feel the existing system is unjust and won't change. That's when the potential for revolutionary action really ramps up.
So when we think about these causes, values decaying, class struggle, wanting freedom, do they play out differently in, say, a social revolution versus just a political one? Are some causes more dominant depending on the type?
That's a great question. Gets right to the heart of it. In a, let's say, purely political revolution, the main driver is often grievances about representation, corruption, or the legitimacy of the rulers. Think no taxation without representation in America.
Okay, focused on the political system itself.
Exactly. Social revolutions, though, tend to be fueled by deeper, more systemic stuff. Stark economic inequality, rigid social structures, widespread cultural dissatisfaction. The French Revolution wasn't just anti-monarchy, it was deeply anti-feudalism, anti-aristocracy.
Right. Broader targets.
And communist revolutions, as Marx saw it, are fundamentally driven by the built-in contradictions of capitalism itself, leading the proletariat to want to overthrow the bourgeoisie and set up a socialist state. So, yeah, while wanting freedom might be common, the nature of the oppression and the scope of the change they want tends to differentiate them.
Okay, so a revolution finally happens. It erupts. What kind of impact does it typically have? It sounds like the consequences can be huge.
Oh, the impacts are profound,
Yeah.
multifaceted. Your sources really stress that revolutions often lead to major transformations across pretty much every dimension of society.
Yeah.
Governments get overthrown, economic systems are radically reformed, social hierarchies get upended, even deeply held cultural values can be challenged and changed.
Wow.
The English Civil War, French Revolution, Russian Revolution, powerful examples of that kind of sweeping change.
And it's not always a smooth path to a better world, is it? Brinton's analysis, talking about those post-revolution phases, they sound volatile. Conflicts, extremism.
Yeah, that's a really astute observation. That initial idealism, the optimism, it can definitely give way to splits between moderate and more radical groups.
Right.
There's often a power vacuum, a struggle for control after the old regime falls. And as Brinton noted, yeah, that turbulence can unfortunately lead to extremists consolidating power, sometimes resulting in new forms of authoritarianism, even totalitarian regimes. We saw that after the French and Russian revolutions.
It's almost sobering. Great hope leading to instability, even new oppression. Makes you think about the sheer difficulty of fundamentally changing society.
It really does. The very intensity of revolutionary change can create instability and just unintended consequences.
And the communist revolutions, they had that very specific impact goal, working class control of production. The sources list Russia, Yugoslavia, China, Cuba, Vietnam.
Right. Those revolutions fundamentally aim to restructure economic power, put the means of production under worker control, in theory, at least. And those movements had a monumental impact on global politics in the 20th century, shaped alliances, conflicts worldwide.
The Cold War, basically.
The Cold War was largely a consequence of that ideological divide, yeah.
Yeah.
Different models for society clashing.
But it's interesting, the sources also point out not all revolutions have the same breadth of impact, a mainly political one, like the American Revolution. It might focus more narrowly on changing who's in power, without necessarily leading to a fundamental social restructuring. Which seems different from, say, the Mexican Revolution, even though we initially grouped it as political. It had deeper social change elements.
That's a really insightful distinction, yeah. Both the American and Mexican revolutions aimed at political change. The Mexican one also involved huge social and economic demands, land reform, peasant rights, leading to a more profound reshaping of Mexican society compared to the American Revolution.
Which didn't immediately tackle slavery, for instance.
Exactly. The American Revolution established a new political order, but didn't immediately dismantle existing social structures like slavery. So ultimately, your sources really paint a complex picture. Revolutions can be incredibly liberating, holding promise, but they also carry significant risks, instability, violence, unintended consequences, with effects that last for generations, locally and globally.
Okay, let's try and synthesize this for you, our listener. We've taken this deep dive into revolution, and it's clear it's way more than just overthrowing power. It's complex, diverse definitions, political shifts, profound social and economic change. We've looked at the types political, social, communist, each with its own aims. We've dug into the causes, often this mix of societal tensions, economic pressures, struggles for power and freedom.
Right, that convergence.
And we've analyzed the huge lasting impacts on governments, societies, even global politics. What's really fascinating is that cyclical nature, some analyses like Brinton's suggest, the buildup, the upheaval, the new order, which might itself hold seeds for future change.
Indeed, and understanding those patterns, the underlying dynamics, It can offer really valuable insights into the forces shaping history.
So, as we wrap up this deep dive, here's a final thought for you. Reflecting on these historical patterns, the subtle value shifts, power dynamics, underlying tensions, what subtle shifts might be happening in our world today that could potentially lay groundwork for future transformations? Think about that intricate interplay of factors and their potential relevance right now. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.